Just to correct, Michael Barone didn't quote me as saying Thomas Barnett is one of the greatest strategic thinkers of time. He said that, not me. I have a healthy ego, and it's been boosted. I'm a season ticket holder for the Green Bay Packers, shareholder. I heard a couple of Steelers fans commiserating earlier today. My advice to them is all you have to do is win 7 more Super Bowls, and then you'll have Green Bay's total of 13 NFL championships. So just a little bit further to go. This is a great subject. I love to talk about it. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the signature concepts from my first book. Pretty much going to skip this one and give you some of the material from this one. This trilogy really looks at the world from a variety of perspectives. Look at it from the system level, which is where you make the arguments about connectivity. Look at it in terms of states. Look at it in terms of individuals. That's where I'm going to focus here, illicit networks. 3 points I like to make, because often when we describe and talk about illicit networks, we add them on top of all our other concerns. So I like to point out, first and foremost, we haven't had great power war since 1945. I don't want to live in a world without nuclear weapons. I like them just fine. I think they do great things. Classic state-on-state war is nearly extinct. Almost all the violence in the system, inside states, spilling across states. The classic state-on-state war going away. So this is what we're left with. Okay, all the people we focus on in terms of illicit networks, including dictators who tend to fund themselves in this manner. My point is simply, do not take this, pile it on top of that, and pile it on top of that, and tell me that's the international system right now. The reason why we focus on illicit networks is because that's what's left over. That is a product of our success. And we see a lot of estimates as to how much it represents. I'll buy into the Wired February magazine one of $2 trillion. Puts a total roughly 3.5% to 4%. Talk to anybody in the legal business, they'll tell you they spend 95% of their time, 95% of their assets dealing with 5% of the behavior in the population. Rule benders, rule breakers. So estimates that put illicit networks at 5% of global GDP, I find believable. The ones that tend to put it much higher tend to fold in financial transactions on top of more GDP type activity. So keep it apples to apples. You get about a 5% share. To me, that's fairly logical. It's much like unemployment in an advanced economy. It's pretty hard to get it below. So I don't believe in a world without illicit networks either. I'm going to give you my definition of the world from the first book. Here's the map we drew back in March 2003. About 150 times now that we've sent forces abroad since the end of the Cold War. All I do here is draw a line around 95%, and I get this shape, which should be familiar in terms of the regions presented to anybody who focuses on illicit networks. My argument is you're looking at the frontier of globalization, that red line, and it's a moving frontier. On the outside, I'll talk about the functioning core of globalization, basically the old west of North America, Western Europe, industrialized Asia, those 3 billion new capitalists in the east, rising pillars in the south. 2/3 of humanity, one-third of humanity. No, 2/3 of humanity living on 90% of global GDP. Sorry, I'm still a little hungover from the game Sunday night. This is too much. 2/3 of humanity, 90% of global GDP. So you can do the math, unlike me. And you can figure out this is 1/3 of humanity living on 10% of global GDP. So Hernando de Soto, a lot of informal networks, a lot of workarounds, a lot of unrecognized capital. Big surprise. I mentioned the Balkans effort. I believe this gap gets shrunk over one belief through peaceful means. Sometimes force is applied. I think we did it successfully across the 1990s. Doesn't mean you get rid of all the problems associated with nation building, those illicit networks that come in and take advantage of failed states. But it does mean you build connectivity over time. With connectivity comes rules, circumscribed behavior, more transparency, tougher for illicit networks to operate. I think you can look at Afghanistan, you can look at Iraq, and no big surprise, this is sort of the battle of the bulge for this part of the world. People think it's all about the networks in here. I will tell you it's about 500 unbranded million teenagers in here and 1.3 billion consumers here, and everybody on this side trying to get here, and everybody on this side trying to get to energy over there. That's why we're interested in that part of the world. Give you an example of this map from a real world crisis. Illicit networks. Subprime, this is where it spread in the first 90 days. So you can see where the connectivity exists, because where it didn't spread is where there aren't financial networks that have the same level of connection. And the matchup between the two maps is pretty good. Now, eventually the slowdown got to the non-integrated gap in terms of reduced commodity demand, but actually because this came back online so quickly, not much loss there. And Africa basically breezes through. Bring up Russia versus Georgia. I like to point out there are 3 different rule set domains described by this picture. Basically, I'm talking about lots of stability across the core because there's lots of connections. Again, connections equal rules, equal circumscribed behavior, equal transparency, equal supply chains you can monitor by and large. The lack of connectivity gives you the opportunity for illicit networks, largely located here. Third rule set domain, though, is the question under which conditions do core great powers get to intervene inside the gap. The United States models a lot of behavior after 9/11. As my wife likes to say every time my 15-year-old son behaves like a jackass, she says, "Where do you think he gets it from?" So we get some copycat behavior, most notably from the Russians, but these are the big questions. NATO's writ, where does it go? The role of Australia is kind of an interesting cop in this part of the world. South Africa's ambitions, non-kinetic but very effective. Brazil, rising energy dependency, resource dependency on the outside world. Russia, the question of its view abroad. That's what's to be worked out. Mantra from the first book, disconnectedness defines danger. Show me parts of the world, regions that are less connected. Inside this shape, since the end of the Cold War, I can show you basically all the wars, all the civil wars, all the ethnic cleansing, all the genocide, all the mass rape as a tool of terror, all the children lured or forced into combat activities, all UN peacekeeping missions, all US nation-building missions, virtually all of the illegal narcotic exporters, virtually all the terrorism, vast majority of which we don't care about, unless it happens to us. All of it inside that shape. Not a neocon invention or fantasy, cannot be voted out of office. Operational reality for the US military, 21st century. Here's the key theme I want to leave with you. We're in a frontier integrating age, meaning this line is moving and moving rapidly. Our problem with globalization isn't that it's moving too slow, it's that it's moving too fast. So this thing gets shrunk, I guarantee you, in the next 25 years. Question is, what are the political military outcomes associated with that? Do we like them or not? Whose consensus seems best represented? How much violence is attached to the process? My favorite example of the connectivity spread. Your cell phones, 30 per 100, 2001. Here it is about the time I published my first book, 2004. Here it is in 2008. And it's basically gone now. Having spent last summer in southern Ethiopia, I can tell you everybody had cell phones. So I make a national grand strategic argument based on this picture. You got to work across the core to improve the ability to withstand, mitigate shocks to the system. 9/11-like shocks, I call them system perturbations, disruptions, and stuff moving, by and large. So whether it's SARS or avian flu or global financial crisis or 9/11, doesn't matter. They're all the same in terms of their disruptive capabilities. Second, you got to discreetly firewall off the core from the gap source exports. Frankly, I tend to focus on pandemics more than anything else. Third, I argue, more controversially, you got to shrink the gap by exporting security, not sell them arms, which we do more than anybody. But the time and attention of our forces to any region's actual or potential levels of mass violence. I argue you need 2 different forces to pull this off. The first half force we know and love, the kill chain force, the 19-year-old force. That one I dubbed the Leviathan, right out of Thomas Hobbes. an unparalleled capacity to wage war. The second half force, the disaster reliever, counterinsurgency force, nation builder, that one we did not have going into Iraq and Afghanistan. We built it among the green community since in response to the pain. That force I dubbed the System Administrator Force, or sysadmin for short, purposely reaching for a networked metaphor in a networked age. Ultimately, this force, this function needs to be more civilian than uniform. Needs to be more USG than just DOD. Needs to be more rest of the world, please, than just the United States. America's not connecting Afghanistan from the other side of the planet. And it's going to be more private sector, foreign direct investment funded than public sector official developmental aid, not even close. In fact, the good stuff doesn't begin until you get the private sector money. Everything else is hospice care. Now you're familiar with the arguments. You can guess sysadmin tints green, soft, Marines, Army, Leviathan tints blue, Naval, Air Force. In the Cold War conflict spectrum, pretty clear hierarchy. You got big wars and small wars. The assumption was anything the Leviathan could do, certainly the sysadmin could do. If I can destroy a country, certainly I can rebuild it. We discover otherwise since 9/11. And the arguments I hear about hybrid wars really is a reversal of fortune. It says, in effect, Mattis makes this argument, this is our Spain to World War II. Anything I learn down here, I can make use of up here, because anybody who fights me will do it in an asymmetrical manner. So anything having to do with this subject is not a waste of time. It's not a diversion of resources. It's an absolute skill set that needs to be accumulated. I will tell you, though, the counter-revolution has already begun. The air-sea battle concept, which I call the Naval and Air Force Full Employment Act of 2011, and globe prompt strike, the notion that we're going to use ICBMs to kill a tall bearded man in northwest Pakistan. No danger shooting ICBMs across China's nose. A real attempt to reintroduce great power war under the threshold of news. Pretty scary stuff, I would argue. Why this matters for this subject. It diverts intelligent resources, limits the evolution of this force, favors the few and the costly over the many and the cheap, drones and whatnot. I'm all about drones. I want them smaller, I want them more numerous, I want them more disposable. Every raid is a Doolittle raid. Every raid. And it keeps us focused on the core instead of where all this activity is occurring. So here's that map again. This is right out of the Wired magazine. There's your migrants. There's your drugs. There's your wildlife. There's your gold. There's your concentration of piracy. And it's interesting. You don't get to the core until you get to things that you typically find in frontier integrating situations. What happens on the frontier? Guns are traded and women are traded. Now, what's America's excuse? I'm not quite sure. We're one of the biggest providers of illicit firearms as well. But you get a clear sense here. All the activity inside my gap, or right on the margins. And the stuff that happens on the margins, again, with the exception of the United States, tends to be the kind of activity, counterfeit goods, firearms, women, that you find in frontier integration situations. So none of it's unusual, none of it's weird. Historically, it's appropriate. I'm going to make an argument about our role in creating this globalization. The reason why I like to make this argument is I like to point to America's past to give us some sense as to how you deal with these sorts of issues. In terms of an American grand strategy, which is poorly articulated, not well understood, I say you can sum up America's entire grand strategy in 2 words: open door. So it's door, not democracy. I'll describe an American system, though, that is the basis for globalization. States uniting, economies integrating, collective security, promotion of transaction network growth. Who takes advantage? Who does the first anything? First picture, first movie, first MP3 file, whatever. It's always pornography. The internet is for pornography, as they say, Avenue Q.